Welcome to the Psychology Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Scott Hoye. The Psychology Talk Podcast is a unique conversation about psychology and behavioral health from around the globe. We help you expand your knowledge by connecting you in conversation with experts in the field. Topics include hypnosis and mind-body treatments, breakthroughs in neuroscience and psychology, social and ethical considerations of behavioral health and psychology, and international trends in mental health and wellness. While you're listening, please take a moment to subscribe to us and give us a like or a review. It helps us to grow and continue to provide you with quality information and interviews. And now, here is the episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, my guest is Brad Warner. Brad is the author of The Other Side of Nothing and numerous other titles, including Letters to a Dead Friend About Zen, Don't Be a Jerk, and Hardcore Zen. A Soto Zen teacher. He's also a punk bassist, filmmaker, and popular blogger who leads workshops and retreats around the world. In addition to his books, his writing has appeared in Lion's Roar, Tricycle, Buddhadharma, and Alternative Press. He also hosts the Hardcore Zen Podcast and talks about Zen almost every day on his YouTube channel. Brad is here today to talk about all, some, or none of the aforementioned things, as well as his new book, The Other Side of Nothing, The Zen Ethics of Time, Space, and Being. Brad, welcome to the Psychology Talk Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Well, you can go ahead and, I gave you a bit of an introduction there, but if you would like to comment on that or add anything to that, so let people know who you are.
I think that covers most of the basics. I just got back from a tour of Europe. If that's interesting to people, I spent a month in Germany, Finland, where else? Belgium and England and France, talking to people about Zen and leading retreats and stuff. So I do that too.
Oh, cool. Well, you weren't playing bass. You're just doing Zen stuff.
I was playing a little ukulele over there, but I wasn't playing bass over there.
Excellent. Okay. How is it received?
Pretty well. I started going over to Europe in 2009. My first European language translation was into Finnish, which I never really thought about Finland at all. And that led to an invitation to do a tour of Finland in 2009. And I had some interest in people because my first teacher, my second Zen teacher in Japan had a number of students from Europe who had asked me after my books started coming out to do talks over there, and I hadn't had the financial means to do so. But once I got this thing going in Finland, I was able to go I think to Germany and England the first time. And so I just made a habit of going to Europe every year once I got the ball rolling. So I've been going there every year ever since 2009. And I've got kind of a little following over there. It's interesting because Zen is a bit newer in Europe than it is in America. It kind of started about 10 years later.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah. Okay. I didn't know that. That's pretty interesting. So was there another form of Buddhism that had like taken root there earlier, like Tibetan or some other?
I mean, there's more Tibetan Buddhism over there than Zen, and I don't know why. The Deshimaru lineage. There was a guy named Taisen Deshimaru who came over to France. So you had this thing where a bunch of guys came over to the United States. Zen guys came over to the United States in the 60s, and then in the sort of late 70s, Deshimaru showed up in France, and then a few more Zen people followed over in various parts of Europe around that time. So it's sort of like this 10-year gap of Zen reaching Europe.
D.T. Suzuki was one of the first popular
Suzuki
guys.
Came over in the 30s in the US. But really, as far as practice centers, you don't really see much happening in the US until the 60s when Shunryu Suzuki started the San Francisco Zen Center.
Okay. And that's kind of your lineage, sort of, kind of?
It's not my lineage. My first teacher was a student of a guy named Kobun Chino, who was brought over by Shunryu Suzuki, but then kind of broke away from the San Francisco Zen Center. So it's a separate lineage. But then I actually was ordained in Japan by a guy who was completely outside of that lineage entirely, a guy named Budo Nishijima. in Japan, who was part of Rempo Niwa's lineage, which is a lineage that never made it to America at all, except I guess from me.
All right. Well, you're the sole lineage bearer here. I guess. Yeah.
I think I'm probably his only Dharma heir in the United States. Somebody was asking me that the other day, and I had to think about it, and I think I might be.
Okay. Cool. Well, you might want to, let's maybe step back a little bit. Some people don't know what Dharma is, right? Or a Dharma heir would be. So maybe you can kind of talk about that. And we're sitting here talking, I know a little about the lineage, partially because of my own dabbling in Buddhism and because I just read your book, because I'm interviewing you kind of around this book with New World Library. But maybe you can talk a little bit about that. And if maybe that's a good jumping off point into ethics and time and space and what your book is talking about, maybe.
Yeah, it's a kind of a complicated thing. It's hard to know where to begin. In the Zen system, you have a lineage system which is common to most forms of Buddhism, where a teacher will formally recognize a student as an authorized teacher in his or her lineage. So that's what a Dharma heir is. So in my case, my teacher, Nishijima Roshi, did this ceremony in which he formally makes me a teacher in his lineage. And you're not supposed to teach unless you are formally recognized as a teacher. So that's what the lineage system is. And mythologically speaking, this supposedly goes back to the Buddha, although historians dispute whether this lineage system, it probably started emerging in China about between 1,000 and 1,500 years ago. It's not clear whether it was present in India in the first few hundred years of Buddhism, but it certainly goes back 1,000 or 1,500 years. So it's a very old system.
And they count that was a Buddhadharma, who was the person who supposedly brought it to China. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So Bodhidharma almost certainly, was part of this lineage system, that started the ball rolling of that, that kind of thing. So, I don't know. So you have these various, lineages. I don't know what else, and it supposedly started with the Buddha having recognized his student Mahākāssapa as being enlightened, as enlightened as he was. I don't know. All of this I sort of take with a big grain of salt. But I don't know if that's all if that's all that interesting to listeners of the podcast.
But they get a sense of like what this is, what the lineage is, and like
I mean, there's a certificate that goes along with it, and it's all very formalized, and there is some kind of, I mean, there have been people, for example, in the United States, there have been a few people who've faked it. There was a guy quite famously, at least among the circles I travel in, named, he called himself Zen Master Rama. I think his real name was Frederick Lenz, who was a fake Zen master, and he made a boatload of money. And he's sort of controversial among Zen circles because he donated a lot of money to some well-known Zen centers, and a lot of Zen centers are still using money donated by Zen Master Rama. He actually committed suicide sometime in the 80s.
Oh.
Wow. So there is that phenomenon of fake Zen masters. There was one guy, I've forgotten his name, and it's probably would be best if I remembered his name that I didn't use it anyway. But he was trying to kind of sneakily get me to endorse his fake Zen mastership. He was hovering around me about 10 years ago.
Okay.
So there are people who try to fake it.
Well, I guess you're not much of a diploma mill. That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that there is this kind of, I think people look for someone from somewhere else or who has gone somewhere else to talk to the great ones.
Yeah.
They've gone over, hung out with Gandalf in the True West or something, or the True East in this case. And then they come back and they have the one true way, or they have some sort of blessing. And I mean, people long for that, I think, largely. But of course, you seem to have a healthy bit of cynicism about everything.
Well, yeah, I do.
Realism.
Yeah,
Realism.
I mean, I think there's something to it. When I met my first Zen teacher was nobody's idea of what a Zen master should be. It was this guy named Tim, who was he's about 10 years older than me. He's still my ordaining teacher, Nishijima Roshi, passed away a few years ago, but Tim is still alive. He's about 10 years older than me. He's a Irish American, nobody's idea of a Zen master. But there was something about him I could tell was special. And there was same thing with Nishijima Roshi. It was just kind of being in his presence. I could tell there was something different about this person, but it was nothing you could kind of put, anything. It was hard to put a finger to it. I don't know what the metaphor I want to put to it. It's hard to quantify these things, but there's something to it. So in the one sense, I believe it, but in the other sense, since it's so hard to quantify, I have to say, if somebody is doubtful about it, I understand that. So, it's.
Well, I meant cynicism in a maybe a realistic perspective of things, and also the fact that you have this kind of, as a lineage holder, air quotes, or in reality, you kind of have.
I've got it in my garage somewhere. The actual paperwork is in a box. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, but your book comes across as you're a very down to earth individual. When you discuss Tim, your college instructor who kind of got you on this path, he also, being an Irish American myself, we're kind of practical individuals.
Yeah.
I think in general. In a roundabout way, sometimes with Irish thinking, like cultural standards.
Yeah.
Kind of down to earth, but in a roundabout way sometimes. But there is, you couldn't put your finger on, but he seemed to have like the right stuff, if you will, is maybe an ethical right stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like a practical kind of ethics, which the book is about.
Mm-hmm.
Seems odd because many people might associate Buddhism or Zen with, kind of a mystical kind of way of looking at things, but maybe mystical and the mundane,
Well, it's a weird thing. If I tell people this is a book about Buddhist ethics, when I first told my publishers that I wanted to write about Buddhist ethics, they were not excited at all. I got the impression that they were like, I don't know if we want to do this book, because I think when people hear Buddhist ethics, they just think, oh, it's going to be like a list of rules. Like, okay, the Buddhist ethics are just the rules that Buddhists live by. Like, okay, I don't know. I try to think of things to compare it, like Jewish ethics are don't eat pork, and Islamic ethics are pray every Friday, or I don't know what they are. I'm just sort of making it up, and they think it's just going to be a list of rules like that. But I think that Buddhist ethics, and maybe other ethics are like this too, but to me, being steeped in the Buddhist ethics, I think it's really fascinating because it's very much tied up with the mystical side of Buddhism.
Right.
Because the Buddhist ethics are very much tied into this idea of universal oneness, this idea of non-duality. The Buddhist ethics are based on the idea of everything and everyone being part of one complete whole that is the entire universe. So the reason to treat everyone and everything that you encounter ethically is because they are ultimately the same as you. Like exactly the same as you, part of you. So the reason to treat people well is because there's no difference between me and that other person. So it's not be ethical to people because God will punish you for not being ethical. It's because you and that person are the same person ultimately. So you're only hurting yourself, which I think is kind of a really interesting basis for ethical behavior.
Yeah, I think it kind of cuts to the chase, right? It cuts to the quick. It's just, if you think of the golden rule, it's like saying, here's the golden rule and here's why.
Yeah.
I think the golden rule kind of leaves that out. It's like, it's like it finishes the sentence, if you will.
Yeah. Do unto others, as you would have others do unto you, because they are ultimately you. But it's hard for us mostly to believe that, because we're kind of, we're taught not to believe that. I think
we look at things in particulars, right, and differentialities and dualism. I think you said that your master is Nishijima.
Nishijima Roshi.
Yeah. He said that there's two types of philosophies, right? Idealism and materialism.
Yeah,
the basic ones. And then you mentioned in the book, Zen ethics are the ethics of action.
Yeah. That was his way of describing it. And I lived with that and heard it for, God, I don't know how many years. I would go to his lectures and he would just repeat that over and over and over. So his idea was that all of the world's philosophies other than Buddhism were either based in idealism or materialism. And materialism is what most people in the world these days, including, I think, most religious folks, are kind of steeped in a materialistic way of looking at things, because our society is really deeply, deeply materialistic these days, which looks at things in a very, I guess we think of it as an objective way of looking at things. Everything is just an object. And idealism, when I first encountered Nishijima Roshi, I was kind of dumb. I'd taken I was a philosophy major for one semester in college, and I didn't understand most of what I heard. So I conflated idealism with optimism, And then I when I was writing the book, I either this book or one of my previous books, I actually looked up idealism on the thesaurus program on my laptop, and it actually gave optimism as one of the synonyms of idealism. So I'm like, oh, I'm not wrong. Other people think this too. But philosophical idealism is that idea that what's in your head or your experiential thing, the experiential side of reality, is the ultimate reality. And in Buddhism is this weird philosophy that sort of sits between the two. Religious philosophies take idealism as the ultimate. The experiential side of reality, the spiritual side is the ultimate. And then materialism says that spirituality is all bunk and there's only matter, inert, dead matter, and that any sort of experiential side of reality is just what's the word? Epiphenomenon. People throw these philosophical ideas at me, and I'm going, "Ooh, I have to look that up." But an epiphenomenon of material existence, something that comes out of material interactions, is just this, side effect of material interactions. Is the fact, that we feel like we're alive is just a side effect of electrons bumping up against each other. But really, all there is matter. And Buddhism takes the view that both of these ways of looking at things are incorrect, and that that it's neither materialistic nor idealistic, which is a really interesting way of looking at it. And I don't know, that was Nishijima Roshi's way of looking at it. And actually, lately, I've been trying to understand, and I've only just started within the last month or so, what contemporary idealistic thinkers think. Because I think Nishijima Roshi was more looking at classical idealism, like who was that guy? Bishop Berkeley or Plato or people like that. But I think there's a whole other. And I think there's a whole stream of contemporary idealists who are kind of maybe inching more towards Buddhism, but I don't know. I'm starting to think maybe that exists these days, but I don't know. I'm just dipping my toes into that water, trying to figure it out.
The background of this would be that's kind of the basis of the book, right? The ethics of it. That you are not separate from everything else. You just perceive that as a kind of trick of the mind, or maybe samskaras, or which is another can of worms to open, right? You talk about the skandhas, and we can maybe get to that. But I thought we'll back up a little bit here and think about the audience and psychology. So
we talked
a little bit.
A little too deep.
No. I could keep going like this because this is fun stuff for me. But I'm an idiot with a doctoral degree, so these kind of things excite me. I took a few notes here. I took a lot of notes as I was reading and enjoying the book. But From my end of things, we talked about this before we kind of started the interview. Like I have a bit of a beef with the heavy use of mindfulness in psychotherapy, not because mindfulness itself is bad or a way to teach people to look at their thoughts without, necessarily judging themselves, I guess, to kind of create a witness mentality, which is helpful. But it's also, largely most people who say they use mindfulness in psychotherapy, they don't practice mindfulness, most of them. And most of them aren't Buddhists. And most of the Buddhism has been torn out of the philosophical aspect and mystical nature of it, and the spiritual nature of it has been taken from it. I mean, there's a lot of studies that show that if you practice mindfulness, and mind you, these are mostly done on monks, from what I understand, who have been practicing meditation for years, but and some showing that just even short-term use of the techniques in patients, they show an increase of brain functioning within areas of focus and reduction of anxiety and depression and so on and so forth. There's enough literature out there for people to find that scientific literature, which is great. But it kind of belies the sense of like we're relying on, in psychotherapy, you want to do that because you're treating people, you want to make sure you get a good outcome, right?
Sure.
But there's also some evidence now, and people are kind of like focusing on how can you incorporate these ideas, I guess, back into the mindfulness if you use it in psychotherapy, because like instead of having just a results orientation, if you have that philosophical orientation within the practice of mindfulness in psychotherapy, it helps people if they incorporate those ideas in their outcome. Yeah. Probably paradoxically, because they're less and less looking at an outcome and just kind of looking at themselves and accepting themselves for who they are. But that's kind of my take on it. But like, I'm curious what your take on like this whole like kind of corporatization of mindfulness and psychotherapy use of mindfulness. What's your take on it? You've been sitting in Zazen for like centuries now. What's your take on that?
Yeah, it's been about 40 years. I did the calculations recently, and I was like shocked how long. But yeah, and I've watched how this stuff has gone. I started pretty young, so that's why it's been so long. But it's been interesting to watch it go, and it seems like it's almost a cycle that every few years a bunch of people will forward me an article or a spate of articles that'll come out in the popular press about the dangers of meditation. And it usually centers around somebody or some group of people who've had bad experiences with mindfulness that has been prescribed to them by psychotherapists. And the most recent one came, oh God, it must have been 4 or 5 years ago. And it was an article, I don't remember which magazine, one of the popular magazines, maybe it was Atlantic or New Yorker or something like that, about a woman who'd done some mindfulness practices, and it had unleashed some demons, and, she'd gone kind of around the bend and ended up committing suicide. Oh, and wow. It was one of these, shocking, tragic stories. And I think the article was titled something, along the lines of the dangers of meditation, really something, right on the nose like that. And basically what had happened, at least as far as my assessment was, it was somebody had tried to take mindfulness out of the context of Buddhism and just thrust somebody into the practice without really understanding all the ramifications of what that sort of practice can unleash in a person. So if you just start meditating without any context for it, what will happen to most people, in the 90 something percentile of people will be relaxation, calm, peacefulness. It'll be really nice. I think for really the vast majority of people, that's what's going to happen. And for a lot of people, it'll just be boring. It'll be so peaceful. It'll be boring and seem pointless. That's how peaceful it'll be. But there's a small number of people who have serious problems that they're dealing with in hidden stuff, in their past and whatnot. And the process of kind of just leaving your mind open to whatever will open a lot of doors. My teacher used to liken it to, he would say, it's like you've got a boiling pot and you just take the lid off and then everything boils over, and starts running over the edges of the pot.
Yeah.
And it can be like that. And a lot of what Buddhism is, a lot of what the rituals and philosophy and whatnot that we call Buddhism today, not all of it, but a lot of it is people who are meditating and trying to figure out how to navigate the various things that come up during a practice of meditation. And so we've got, the way I like to put it is we've got approximately 2,500 years of research and development into what happens during meditation and what we can do about it. And a lot of the solutions that have come up have been informed by ritual and religion and various things like that. So it looks like ritual and religious practice, which is why a lot of people shy away from it. In a clinical setting, you don't want to introduce things that look religious. I can perfectly understand that.
Oh, come on. A green Tara in the midst of a psychotherapy session sounds great.
See, I can understand why people don't want to introduce that. And so I get it. I get why that's problematic in those settings. But I think if you are going to toss all of that stuff away, you're going to have to come up with some sort of adequate substitute for it, because you're going to have to deal with these things.
Well, I think there's two things. I'm going to what you're saying. I agree with what you're saying. If you just thrust these kind of techniques, even if they're the most simple ones, on people who are dealing with psychological demons, so to speak, yes, you can have bad outcomes. It's so, for instance, like I practice hypnosis in my practice, and I've been doing it since about 2002 in various permutations. And there's a lot of crossover between those techniques and meditative techniques. They're not the same. They're a different intent. And it's a bit more of like, if you want the metaphor, hypnosis is a bit more like moving the wires around inside of a computer box or something, trying to work on the software or hardware differently. And it's not, it doesn't have the same kind of like, you should, as a clinician, have a good ethical grasp of things, but it's not like inherent upon the patient to have an ethical or have a worldview that's a self, no self kind of worldview. It's not necessary. But what I would say is that in practice, in any of these kind of techniques, like Eugene Gendlin's focusing technique, which is old and very similar to meditation, or hypnosis techniques or meditative techniques, if you don't have a grasp of how dissociative a person is, or how much trauma they might have suffered and not know about because they are dissociative, or a number of things, or how psychotic they are, and you just use these techniques, yes, I mean, you could easily evoke some issues with the patient. So I think it's poor training on the part of us clinicians, because a lot of it is kind of like throw people to the dogs or the wolves, if you will, after a little bit in training in graduate school. That doesn't make you a wise person or give you a whole lot of understanding of how the mind works. And there's very little training in dissociation, which is inherent in the study of hypnosis, which I would argue is probably, as you said, after that 2,500 years of research and development, or more from Eastern meditation techniques, not to say that it's because they're from the East, but those schools of meditation, there are ways of handling things or assessing places of, how much a practitioner could take at any point in time, and a way of helping them kind of grasp how they're growing their perception of their mind and how they're.
And there are ways to describe it. There's traditional ways to describe the states that one gets into. Yeah. Which, you accept, they're metaphors, and you kind of go, okay, well, this is the bardo or whatever. That's what Zen doesn't get into bardos and stuff, but Tibetan Buddhism does. Right. So there are ways to describe it, and you live in the framework of that, and you go, okay, well, I'm not going completely crazy. I'm just entering the bardo of this or that, and it's it's understood, right?
It normalizes it to a degree, and it helps you understand and navigate that state of mind, if you will, or that place you found yourself in, if you using a topographical kind of map metaphor. Yeah, exactly. And if you just kind of unleash any kind of technique on someone unwittingly, you could 10% might have a very big abreaction to what you're doing. Yeah.
And I think there's I think because the meditation techniques are so simple, people might underestimate the power of them, because you're just sitting there, still and being quiet, and you can go, well, that's nothing.
Exactly. It is nothing. Right. Yeah.
And then you go, well, that can't hurt. But I think people are kind of underestimating what can take place in just that very simple sort of setting of just, being very, very quiet.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's very, it can be extremely discomforting for people to do that. And it can stimulate a lot of anxiety, I think, for people too, on some level. Yeah. A lot of folks, when I do a guided meditation or a hypnotic technique with them, when I'm in the room, great results. If they're doing it at home and they have an MP3, okay results until they get bored with it. They become acclimated to it. And then if they're trying to do it on their own, good luck.
Well, yeah, and the type of meditation I do, which is called shikantaza, is just sitting. So there's no guidance at all. So this can be really, when I first started doing it, my initial reaction was total boredom. I was just like, oh my God, I can't stand this. But then after a while, it gives way to frustration and kind of anger, and then everything gets just sort of unleashed. I often describe it. People will come into a zendo and think, oh, these people are sitting peacefully. They must be having this experience of spiritual bliss and whatever. But actually, if you were to look into the minds of all the people sitting in the room, some of them are freaking out, and some of them are just going, oh my God, I got to get out of here. There's all kinds of things going on.
What did you do with yourself last weekend? Oh, I tortured myself. Silently. It was so loud, and inside this brain, it was so hot, so loud. Yeah. So what do you think might be, what advice might you give to psychotherapists who really want to use mindfulness in their practices? And I'm not knocking people who do that, although like some of his hypnotists call it, mindlessness at times, but
nobody's ever asked that. I don't know. I would think it would be good to study up on the literature that's out there, and it would be good to practice it yourself. I would think that would be useful. Maybe go on an actual meditation retreat before trying to teach. At least one or two meditation retreats before trying to teach it to patients. So you have at least the experience yourself of what it can be like, and see, because I don't know what's really going on out there in the field, but some of the things I've read talk about people going through like a 30-day course in learning about meditation. which doesn't include any actual meditation. And I go, oh my God, because in order to teach, like I was talking about becoming a lineage holder, most people are studying with their teachers for at least, a decade would be a very short time, to become a lineage holder. That would be pretty remarkable if you studied with a teacher for 10 years and he or she gave you permission to become a teacher yourself. So, 30 days, when I hear about people becoming authorized meditation instructors after 30 days, I'm like, oh my God,
yeah. It's sort of like, I think Yoga Journal now, just like if you've done 200 hours of classes, they'll give you a certificate. So you're now a yoga instructor, certified. Like, I don't know, but I'm sure there's lots of people with serious injuries who have yoga instructors who aren't so well trained and don't know anatomy so well. And it is kind of it's kind of a no man's land for like snake oil. Even in my profession, I think. And you're right, like 30 days. 30 days would be okay if you were an instructor, if you were incorporating a 30-day training with, John Kabat-Zinn or something. That might be good. Most people do like a 12-hour CEU course for meditation, right? And that's there's like variations in how much people study hypnosis, which again is another kind of how the mind works, what you can do with it, how good you are at dissociating or hypnotizable techniques and whatnot, and what results you can get. But it's not the same as practicing something, right? So I think you're right. I think I think for those out there who want to really deepen their practice as psychotherapists and use mindfulness, I think what you're saying, Brad, is probably a really good idea. I have a good friend, Ian Wickramasacra, who's been studying Tibetan Buddhism forever, long time. And he's big in the hypnosis world and psychology. And he incorporates them, goes back and forth between those worlds, so to speak. But he's I don't know if he's a lineage bearer in that tradition, but he's always training in Bon and various Tibetan meditation techniques, and always doing retreats, and just a real sweetheart of a guy too. So, but I think that would be important. I also think that there needs to be more of a back and forth between. There shouldn't be as much separation between like all of the research data that's out there in hypnosis, because there's a lot of it, and that which is the R&D, 2,500 years of R&D with, techniques in meditation. I think that would bear a lot of fruit if you kind of cross-pollinated those two schools.
I think it's good that they're starting to inform each other. I think that there was an initial period, which I think we're coming out of, thankfully, in which Western psychology sort of looked at meditation as kind of like, oh, this is like a primitive form of psychotherapy, and then sort of, looked at it as kind of we'll incorporate this as and looked down upon it, as right, like these guys aren't as smart as us, but we can incorporate some of these dumb primitive forms of psychotherapy into what we do. But now I think there's more respect for it.
Oh yeah,
which is good. Yeah. And I think if the two traditions are looking upon each other respectfully, then that can be a good thing, because they can inform each other, because they're looking at the same thing from two different angles, which I think is always a good which is always a good thing and can be fruitful.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I'm of the opinion that indigenous spirituality and healing techniques can inform the so-called real medicine or allopathic medicine and behavioral health. The Western model that seems to be the one that's kind of out there colonizing the rest of the world right now. I think it's important to have. I think it's important for people to steep themselves in their own traditions, and I think it's also important for those to inform what's going on with like materialistic science and medicine.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely it's interesting because there's definitely something to be said, obviously, for Western science and the Western approach to things. I mean, look at us; we're talking on this, amazing little computer system that works really well because Western science has figured out how to make this kind of communication possible. So obviously we've got some things right in Western science, but I think there's this kind of hubris among Westerners because we've got so many things right to think we've got everything right and our approach is the ultimate approach, and any other approach has got to be, by definition, not as good.
Correct,
so looking into how these other approaches might actually have some things, they might actually do some things better than we can do them, I think is really important to understand.
I think it's important for Western trained folks in medicine and behavioral health to also embody the mind of the indigenous technologies, if you will, or the indigenous outlooks on things. I think it's important for you to actually sit in that. If everyone is forced to sit in a Western way of thinking of things, or I guess a materialistic scientific perspective, or physicalistic scientific perspective, then conversely, you should be able to practice the other way of looking at things.
Yeah.
Right. I think you should be able to. That's like cognitive flexibility, which I think is important. But it's not going to. It probably won't make your Zoom call any better. But
no, no. But I think that's the middle way that the Buddhists are reaching for. It's kind of what I was, what my teacher was talking about. That idealism and materialism. Neither one is correct. Right. And I think maybe the sort of what we're calling the indigenous perspective in this particular conversation would be more along the lines of what my teacher would have called the idealistic way of looking at things. Right. And there is, and we're looking at it, the form of thinking that produced Zoom calls would be the materialistic perspective. Right. And there's something to be said for both of them, but neither one is the one correct and true path. There is a middle ground in which, so you kind of go, well, neither one of these is the true correct path. There's a middle way between the two where they can inform each other, and we can find something that's better than either one of these.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, now that we've kind of dabbled in that, and we've worked on our compromise between those things. Maybe we can go back and talk a little bit more about your book.
Sure.
I don't think we can do it justice in the next 15 minutes to 20 minutes we have left here. But like, how would you summarize your book? And I maybe one way I could do this is you talk about the Eightfold Path.
Yeah.
And how that's applicable. And you give specific kind of contemporary ways of approaching that from your own kind of punk rock viewpoint, if you will, or contemporary American viewpoint. And you also talk about those skandhas. I think those are fascinating for me as somebody who likes dissociation and hypnosis and meditation.
Well, yeah, there's all these sort of traditional Buddhist formulas, and I tried to go through a bunch of them in the book. So the Eightfold Path is what supposedly the historical Buddha laid out as being the ethical path of Buddhism. And I can never remember all eightfolds without looking them up. And I had to look them up when I wrote the book, and I don't have the book sitting next to me, but it's like right view, right thinking, right mindfulness, right livelihood. And I went through all of them to try to, and I had access to this wonderful piece of literature that was put out by a group of American Buddhists who went through a whole bunch of different ways of laying out what these were and the historical, precedents for different interpretations of them. What they mean. And the kind of one that really kind of fascinated me was right livelihood. In Buddhism, there's this idea of right livelihood.
Yeah.
This one vexes contemporary American Buddhists more than any other, it seems. And it really bothered me because I came across it. I first started studying Buddhism properly when I was I think, a freshman or sophomore in university. I just came back from Europe and I realized that we Americans tend to use college and university interchangeably, but it's not so in Europe. So
Right.
I was like careful to say university and not college. Anyway, so I was like 19 or 20 years old. And so thinking about what to do for a living was a big deal. And then I come across Buddhists talking about right livelihood. I'm like, oh my God. And there's this whole camp of American Buddhists who think that right livelihood means you have to be a yoga instructor or a therapist are the only things that are permissible right livelihood. Everything else is wrong livelihood. And they really worry about that. But
I can check that off my box of things to check off.
But to traditional Buddhists, the only right livelihood possible was being a monk, so it gets even worse. So there's all these ideas of trying to do the right thing, but it's mostly about approach. It doesn't even really matter exactly what job you do. It's how you do the job. You approach the job as a form of service. So no matter what job you do it as a form of service to the world. And the whole Eightfold Path is kind of all like that. It's not exactly stringent, like you must do these things. It's more like the way you approach how you.
Well, is right the correct word to use, or is it just the most convenient, succinct way of translating it?
Yeah, it's the most convenient way of translating. And I do go into that in the book about the different ways. Now I can't come up with it off the top of my head because it's a certain Chinese character that has been used that gets translated as right, but it's sort of like correct or proper, or there's different ways of translating that Chinese character.
Would it mean more would it be more like a balanced way of doing things?
Yeah, balanced is a good way of putting it. And then you asked about the skandhas. That comes from the in Buddhism. There's this famous idea of non-self, which some people might have heard of, because the older Indian philosophy had this idea of Atman, which in at least Buddha's time, which is 2,500 years ago, was thought of in a similar way to the Christian idea of a soul, which is that there's this immaterial sort of ghostly something that sits, in some forms of Hinduism, it's actually thought of as being in a specific, this is going to be audio only, but it's supposed to be sitting somewhere inside your chest. And then it, departs at the time of death, but it's an immaterial being that is actually your real person. And it's changed in Hinduism since the Buddha's time. But anyway, the Buddha rejected this idea that there was an immaterial something that was your true self that was separate from your material body. And instead, he said there's 5 skandhas, which are form, feeling, perceptions, impulses, and consciousness that come together to form the person. And that you can, this gets really deep and weird and philosophical, but that the whole universe is the coming together of these 5 skandhas. But it kind of almost doesn't matter what the 5 skandhas are. The basic idea is that when we think of ourselves as a unified single whole being, but what we are is a kind of a combination of things.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Or the coming together of a combination of things that seems to be a unified whole, but really isn't.
There's a wonderful book that James Fadiman, who's a transpersonal psychologist and father of microdosing, if you can imagine that. Yeah. He co-wrote this book with, I forget his co-author's name. It's called Your Symphony of Selves. And he actually goes into like these other kind of ways, like Buddhist way of looking at things, or, so this kind of like resonates with me as someone who tries to help people work with inner conflict amongst their selves, not their, I guess, impulses too. It kind of makes sense. If you break things down to granular, I think we are that makes a lot of sense. That's why I was kind of fascinated with the idea of skandhas, especially samskaras.
Yeah, the samskaras is the one that nobody seems to be able to translate. I think when I ran through it, I ran through it by rote memory from the way I memorized the Heart Sutra. So I think it's form, feeling, perception, impulses, consciousness. So impulses is the way I first learned samskaras, but there's I don't know, there's like a dozen different ways to translate samskaras. But yeah, that's a really hard one to translate.
Well, do you recall who the Tibetan Buddhist master was who founded Shambhala? Not Shambhala, but was it? I should know. Right? My friend Ian's. Yeah, my friend Ian's gonna give me a hard time about this. He founded Naropa University.
That would be Chogyam Trungpa, maybe.
Yes.
Yeah.
People were asking him one time, what's left when you get rid of down to like what actually reincarnates? Oh, samskaras.
Just the impulse to be. Yeah, probably.
But it's also perspective too, right?
Yeah. Like I say, there's many ways to translate that, and perspective is one of them, or sort of God, I can't remember them off the top of my head, but there's so many ways. And it's whenever I come across those formulas, because I'm not good at keeping them straight myself, I just think, okay, these are Dogen, who's the founder of the form of Zen that I study, talked about the complicated. That's the way my teacher used to. The actual metaphor he used was tangled vines, but my teacher always translated that as the complicated. He would just say that we're getting into the complicated. So it's just that there are things that are so complicated that all you can just say is that's just that tangled mess over there, and it's so complicated that you might as well not try to figure it out. It's just that that messy stuff.
And in the Heart Sutra, maybe you can talk a little bit about that. You mentioned that, and it kind of does, in some respects, it forms maybe the heart of the basis of your book, right?
Well, yeah, that was the thing. That was my gateway drug into Buddhism. When I got into Buddhism because I took this class. I was a young punk rock kid, bass player for a hardcore punk band, and I happened to take this class at Kent State University called Zen Buddhism, which I had grown up partly in Africa. When I was a kid, we lived in Kenya, in Nairobi. And there's a big Indian population there, and I've been exposed to Indian religions, and I got fascinated. And when we moved back, it was a few years before I got to university, and I just decided I wanted to learn something about Indian religions. And the only class I could find about Indian religion was a class called Zen Buddhism, and all I knew about Buddhism was it was a Japanese form of an Indian religion. So I took this class, and the first thing that the teacher did in the class, this was Tim, that Irish American guy I mentioned, was he read the Heart Sutra, and it's probably the shortest. It must be the shortest sutra in all. Some sutras are 1,000 pages or 5,000 pages long. This one fits, when you translate it in English, on a single page, and it just lays out really all the basics that you need to know about the Zen form of Buddhism in the shortest possible summation. In fact, what's great about it is it's already short, and the last paragraph is pretty much a throwaway paragraph. So it's even shorter than it seems. And what I think is neat about it is it takes all of the basic tenets of classical Buddhism and denies them. So it's almost as if you found a secret chapter in the Bible that said, no savior, no salvation, no heaven, no God, or something like that, that just denied everything that you thought you knew about the Bible.
Right.
So to Buddhists of the time that it actually was produced, it must have seemed really shocking because it just denies everything about classical Buddhism. But it's sort of saying everything you think you know about anything, just think again, because anything you think you know about anything is just a concept in your mind. And I was particularly struck by a line that said, "Form is emptiness, emptiness is form." And I remember, because I didn't know anything about Buddhism, like I said, but I remember hearing that line and thinking, okay, that's what I want to study. I want to study this philosophy that says form is emptiness, emptiness is form. I want to know what that means. And it just kind of, put me on that path for the rest of my life, just hearing that line.
It denies every. I mean, it's kind of like saying, don't get caught up in the particulars, dude. I mean, in some respect, it's an admonition, and at the same time, it helps you as a sutra. It helps you, I guess, it just helps you kind of focus your mind on these paradoxes, so that you don't get caught in material or idealism, right?
Yeah,
which is good, I think.
Which, I think so. And I didn't know what it meant. I'm still, this is The Other Side of Nothing, I think, is my 10th book on Buddhism. And it also, just like my first book on Buddhism, has a chapter on the Heart Sutra. So I've been still working on trying to, every book that I write, I'm trying to explain to myself as much as I'm trying to explain to the readers what it is that I'm trying to explain. So I'm still trying to explain the Heart Sutra to myself. And, I feel like every time I get a little bit closer.
Okay. Well, maybe it's not the point of explaining it totally and completely, but it's the process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think I'll ever get there. It's like infinite regression or something.
Well, do you feel like, you wrote a book on Buddhist ethics, even though New World Library tried to tell you not to do that. Do you feel like we all change as we get older, but you kind of have this world, the Zen Buddhist world, to kind of circumnavigate and live from. How do you think it's affected your moral and ethical development as a human being? I mean, what do you think it's done for you?
Boy, it's hard to say, because I don't know what I'd be without it. I did write, when I first started writing, I wanted to be a novelist. I had no intention of writing books about Zen Buddhism, and there's a whole story about that. But anyway, so one of the novels I wrote, I posited a character who would be me if I never encountered Buddhism, and he was this horrible person. The more I thought about what I'd be like, so when I think about what I'd be like without it, I think I'd be a big mess. And so I think it's really helped me live a better life than I would have without it. But of course, it's impossible to know. You can't really know. That's why I could only figure it out, approximate it in a work of fiction. But I do feel like, if I look at the people I grew up with and the other people who came out of that sort of punk rock scene that I was part of, I think it's really helped stabilize me in ways that I don't think other people had access to, without, just this simple thing of every morning and every night I sit on a cushion and stare at a blank wall for half an hour at a time, which seems like, a really dumb thing to do. But just doing that over and over and over again seems to have made this tremendous difference. And I think that's the biggest part of the practice I do. I mean, there's other things that go along with it. There's certain ritual things and whatnot, and going to retreats and doing other stuff. But the main thing has been just sitting on that cushion, day after day after day. And I did it just before we started talking. So
okay. Wow.
It's something I continue to do. And that's made a huge, huge difference.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you developed a kind of third eye, if you will, for that kind of a witness mentality. You think it helps you be a little less disappointed sometimes, or takes a sting? I mean, I think the whole point of psychotherapy, like I said, and or implied at least, and Buddhism, is to relieve suffering.
Yeah. One thing I used to tell people that I was I've stopped telling them, except in the format that I'm doing right now, which is I used to tell people, is I realized my thoughts are only thoughts. I stopped using that line because I realized it wasn't landing that well. But now I'm using it this way, which is I just realized that every thought I had, no matter how big or how important it felt, or how driving or how annoying or whatever it was just a thought. So anything that pops into my head is just a thought. So if it's the worst thought or the meanest thought or the happiest thought or whatever thought it is, or if it's, I want to kill my landlord or whatever it is, it's just my brain doing a thing. And that was, if I say it out loud, it just sounds like nothing, I feel like, but to realize it in a really deep way was so freeing. And I can remember the moment when that became really apparent to me. There was just a moment where I just realized that no matter what thought popped into my mind, it was just a thought. And I didn't have to act on it. I didn't have to identify it as myself. I didn't have to worry about it. I didn't have to care where it led to, where it came from, what it meant. It's just a thought. It doesn't matter.
Well, I a lot of times that's as I sit in sessions with people, I'm thinking, if I could just get this person to see that their thinking is just a thought, that's all, and not be so caught up in a belief system about it. Like,
I don't have to believe my own thoughts. Right. And just to realize I don't have to believe anything that comes into this head.
That's nice. Yeah, it's a nice thing. It's a nice thing. Yeah. Okay, you can kind of go window shopping with your thoughts.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, people in the audience, the book is The Other Side of Nothing: The Zen Ethics of Time, Space, and Being. If it sounds like we were having a strange philosophical discussion, we did have that. And at the same time, if you read the book, it will read like that, but it doesn't at the same time. It's very practical. It's very practical and fun to read if you're looking for something to expand your mind and really take a deep dive into Zen Buddhism with a contemporary American practitioner and teacher. Please pick it up. It's from New World Library. Brad, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. You're welcome back on anytime you want to come.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been good.
Excellent. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Did you know you can find the Psychology Talk podcast everywhere? Well, maybe not everywhere, but you can find us on Facebook and Instagram, and we have a website, www.psych-talk.com. All material is copyright the Psychology Talk podcast. This podcast is for entertainment and informative purposes only. If you need a behavioral health specialist, please seek one out. Music is provided by the band Serenati.